Well, here at the G7 in Bavaria in Germany, Russia's war in Ukraine has very much topped the agenda. G7 leaders have agreed to work on a possible price cap for Russian oil that would be designed to cut Moscow's energy revenue, which is funding its war in Ukraine. Wrapping up the summit, the leaders of the world's 7 wealthiest democracies sent a strong signal of long-term commitment to Ukraine's future, while promising that Russia will pay a higher price for its invasion.
As the G7, we agree on the assessment that this concerns very long-term changes that will affect international relations for a very, very long time. This is why it is clear the ties to Russia cannot return to what they were before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Because when the situation changes, we also need to change. Everyone very much knows this.
The leaders are announcing steps to boost global food security. They're pledging $5 billion to help resolve food supply problems sparked by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The G7 has also condemned China for distorting international trade practices. Well, for more, we're being joined by our principal diplomatic correspondent, Siddhant Sibal, who's in Munich. Siddhant, what do you take away from this summit as it wraps up? What have been the key themes and conclusions here?
Well, great to speak with you, Oli. The big outcomes in terms of this summit was and has been the action taken by the West when it comes to supporting Ukraine and, of course, statements condemning Russia, something that was on expected lines. But we have seen, while statements have come out, what support the Ukrainian government gets on ground is something that is to be seen. Remember, the Ukrainian President Zelensky had a conversation lasting for almost 2 hours yesterday, in which his key focus was more defense support. The Americans are working on a package, but it is yet to be seen how much support in terms of defense the West is going to give to Ukraine. But largely a very long communique, almost 28 pages long communique has been issued. It mentions Russia almost 32 times and largely imposes sanctions in terms of use of Russian gold, as you talked about the cap being put on Russian crude, but also mentions China, because China is another big worry. One interesting line that has come across in the communique is any attempt by China to change the situation on the ground unilaterally. Now that resonates strongly back home in India, given that China has been indulging in actions at the line of actual control. We saw just 2 years ago the Galwan incident in which India lost 20 of its soldiers. So that is something that is a takeaway for India. But largely there was focus area on climate, on energy. In fact, Afghanistan is also mentioned, while it might not make it into headlines given the Russia-Ukraine crisis is dominating. The G7 has called on Taliban to give and support the women's rights, something we have seen from the West for a long time. But will Taliban change its course is something that is yet to be seen.
And Siddhant, talk to me about that proposed price cap on Russian oil. It seems to have changed shape several times over the course of the last few days here in Germany. Are we ever likely to see it actually in action?
Well, that's the big question. The West has been announcing a lot of things. Will it be put on the ground, something that pinches Russia? Yes, Russia is not very happy with the imposition of sanctions, especially against President Putin. But what Russia has been doing while these caps have been announced, more details are awaited on these caps. Russia has been looking at countries like India and China for its import of its crude. We have seen an increase of discounted crude oil, something that has made the West not very happy about it. So Russia has been able to bypass the sanctions, and while the West has been announcing sanctions, things on the ground are very different. The aggression continues. In fact, while the G7 meeting continues, it is over now, but on the first day we saw attacks in Kyiv, then we saw attack at the shopping mall, which has been described as the worst terror attack on European soil since World War II by the G7 leaders. The the Russian president, it looks like, is not deterred, or he is not willing to change his course despite the voices coming out. Perhaps a more brave face will be required from the West to change Putin's current stance. We might see it in Madrid.
And Siddhant, just briefly, you're in Munich, where Narendra Modi was staying while he was here for that outreach day of the G7 summit with those invited democracies. How do you think that went from a G7 perspective, but also from an Indian perspective? Was that day considered successful?
Well, for India, it is a success that India has been invited at G7. This was Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's third time that he is at a G7 meeting invited by the president. He's now reached UAE, the second leg of his two-day foreign, two-country visit. But largely, it's a success for India in terms of able to showcase what it wants to get out from the West. We know that when it comes to the G7 leaders, yesterday we saw the visuals. We're very happy to meet Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Those informal visuals spoke a lot, especially the US President Biden and the French President Macron meeting the Indian Prime Minister. But it also helps the G7 because it has been criticized for being a limited group in terms of the Western membership. So the presence of countries like India and other countries who were invited, the global south, shows that G7 is willing to work with other countries to come out with a solution from various issues, not just Russia-Ukraine war, but also climate change and commodity prices. While these countries, including India, have stayed away from criticizing Russia, they got a lot of positive outcomes in terms of energy initiatives being taken forward, and of course President Biden's infrastructure partnership, which is going to benefit these countries as well.
Okay, Siddhant, thank you. Safe travels. That's Siddhant Sabal joining me live from Munich as the G7 summit wraps up here in Bavaria.